Hey there, and welcome back to another journey through the darker corners of history. Tonight we're diving into something that might make you reconsider your weekend plans, or at least appreciate them a whole lot more. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment and let me know. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all here together, exploring the messier side of human nature across the centuries. Now, if you enjoy this kind of historical deep dive, consider hitting that subscribe button, but only if you genuinely find value in what we're doing here. And with that said, let's settle in and explore why getting drunk in medieval times was an absolute nightmare compared to our modern world. Picture this. It's a Friday night in 2025. You're getting ready to head out with friends, maybe to that new cocktail bar downtown. Or perhaps you're planning to hit up a club with those LED lights and bass that you can feel in your chest. You've got your phone to call an Uber. Your friends are texting the group chat about meeting times. And you know that if things get too wild, there are hospitals nearby, police who'll actually help you, and laws that protect you from the worst that humanity has to offer. Now imagine instead that you're living in a damp, cold village in medieval Europe. The year is 1347, and your idea of a good time involves drinking ale that tastes like liquid bread mixed with pond water, in a tavern that smells like a combination of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and something that died behind the wall 3 months ago. There's no music except maybe a drunk guy with a lute who knows 2 songs, both of which are about either God or death. There are no lights except flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on walls stained with substances you'd rather not identify. This is the world where getting drunk wasn't just different from today, it was downright dangerous in ways that would make your worst hangover seem like a spa day. Let's start with something we take completely for granted in 2025, knowing what you're actually drinking. Today, when you order a drink at a bar, you have a pretty good idea of what's in it. Vodka is vodka, beer is beer, and that craft cocktail with the fancy name has ingredients listed right there on the menu. You know roughly how much alcohol is in each drink. You can pace yourself. And if you're smart about it, you can have a good time without completely destroying your liver or your dignity. Medieval people. They had no idea what they were consuming. None. The concept of alcohol content was as foreign to them as the concept of germs or basic human rights. They drank ale, mead, wine, and various other fermented concoctions. But the strength of these drinks varied wildly, depending on who made them, how long they'd been sitting around, and whether or not the person brewing them had any clue what they were doing. Imagine walking into a bar today and ordering a beer, but sometimes it's as weak as water, and sometimes it's strong enough to strip paint. Sometimes it's been sitting in a barrel for months, slowly turning into vinegar. Sometimes it's been contaminated with things that would make a modern health inspector weep. And sometimes, because medieval people were wonderfully creative with their intoxication methods, it's been mixed with herbs, spices, or other substances that could send you on a trip that would make a modern drug experience look like a children's tea party. The medieval world didn't have quality control. They didn't have regulations. They didn't have the FDA or health departments or any of the countless agencies that ensure your Saturday night drinks won't actually kill you. If you were lucky, your ale was just strong and tasted terrible. If you were unlucky, it was contaminated with ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. Medieval people called it St. Anthony's fire, and it was just one of the many delightful surprises that could be waiting in your drink. But here's where things get really dark, and where our modern world shows just how much we've progressed, even if we still have work to do. In 2025, we have laws. We have social norms. We have at least some understanding that consent matters, that children should be protected, and that violence isn't an acceptable response to disagreement. Are these systems perfect? Absolutely not. Do we still have problems with alcohol abuse and its consequences? Unfortunately, yes. But we've built structures, however imperfect, that attempt to protect the vulnerable. Medieval times? There were no such protections. None. The concept of protecting children from adult behavior was barely a whisper of an idea. The notion that women deserved safety and respect was revolutionary thinking that would get you branded a heretic. And the idea that there should be limits on how much you could drink, or consequences for what you did while drunk, was completely foreign. Children in medieval times weren't just exposed to adult drinking culture, they were immersed in it. There was no separation between adult spaces and child spaces, no 21 and older signs, no designated drivers to make sure kids got home safely. Children as young as 5 or 6 were given watered-down ale because it was often safer than drinking water. But that line between watered down and full strength was blurry at best, and in many cases, non-existent. Picture a medieval feast, the kind you might see romanticized in movies or TV shows. Everyone's drinking from the same barrels, the same jugs, the same cups. The lord of the manor is getting progressively drunker, his voice getting louder, his temper getting shorter. The servants are drinking too, because what else are they going to do? The children are there, watching, learning, absorbing the idea that this is normal adult behavior. And when things turned violent, as they inevitably did, those children had nowhere to go. No child protective services, no police to call, no shelters to flee to. They just had to endure whatever happened next, whether it was watching their parents fight, being on the receiving end of drunken rage, or worse. Women face similar dangers, but with even fewer options for escape. In our modern world, a woman can leave an abusive situation. It's not easy, it's not always safe, and our systems aren't perfect, but the options exist. Shelters, legal protections, support networks, the ability to work and support herself independently. These things exist because we've slowly, painfully learned that they're necessary. Medieval women had none of these options. A woman married to a man who became violent when drunk had no recourse. She couldn't divorce him. She couldn't leave him. She couldn't even complain about him without risking being labelled a disobedient wife, which came with its own set of punishments. The law didn't protect her. The church told her that her suffering was God's will. Her family might support her, but they also might tell her to endure it for the sake of family honour. And in a world where getting drunk was the primary form of entertainment, where alcohol was consumed daily, where there were no limits or consequences, this cycle of abuse was constant. It wasn't an occasional problem. It was the fabric of daily life. The taverns of medieval times weren't like our modern bars. They weren't regulated, monitored, or controlled in any meaningful way. They were dark, dangerous places where violence was expected and tolerated. Fights didn't result in calling the police or being banned from the establishment. They resulted in blood on the floor, broken bones, and sometimes death. And everyone just cleaned up the mess and kept drinking. Imagine going to a bar today where the bartender's main job wasn't mixing drinks, but breaking up fights with whatever weapon was handy. Where the entertainment wasn't music or games, but watching people beat each other senseless. Where the only rule was that if you could still stand, you could keep drinking. This was the medieval tavern experience. But let's talk about what we have today that makes drinking culture, while still imperfect, infinitely safer and more enjoyable than anything medieval people could imagine. When you go out drinking in 2025, you're not just consuming alcohol. You're participating in a rich, varied, creative culture that has evolved to maximize fun while minimizing harm. You can go to a cocktail bar where skilled bartenders create drinks that are literally works of art. Cocktails with names like Smoke and Mirrors or The Last Word that involve techniques and ingredients that would seem like magic to a medieval person. You can watch the bartender muddle herbs, flame orange peels, create layers of different coloured liquids that somehow don't mix. It's theatre, it's chemistry, it's craftsmanship. You can go to a brewery and taste dozens of different types of beer, each one carefully crafted to highlight different flavours, textures and aromas. IPAs that burst with hop flavor, stouts that taste like chocolate and coffee, sours that make your mouth pucker in the best possible way. Medieval people had ale, maybe wine if they were lucky. That was it. You can go to a wine bar and learn about vintages, regions, grape varieties, and food pairings. You can taste wine from vineyards around the world, each one telling a story about the soil, the climate, the passion of the people who made it. Medieval people had whatever wine was available, and they were grateful if it didn't taste like vinegar. But it's not just about the drinks themselves. It's about the entire experience. You can go to a club where world-class DJs create soundscapes that move through your body like liquid energy. You can dance until your feet hurt, lose yourself in music that connects you to thousands of other people, all moving to the same beat. You can experience lights, sounds, and energy that would overwhelm medieval senses accustomed to candlelight and silence. You can go to karaoke bars and sing your heart out to songs that span decades and genres. You can be terrible at it, and everyone will cheer you on anyway. You can be amazing at it and feel like a rock star for 3 minutes. Medieval people sang, sure, but it was mostly religious music or folk songs about death and disease. You can go to paint and sip classes, where you create art while enjoying wine with friends. You can attend murder mystery dinners, where you solve crimes while drinking cocktails. You can play arcade games, shoot pool, try your hand at darts, or challenge friends to trivia contests. The options for combining alcohol with entertainment are literally endless. And here's something that would blow a medieval mind. You can do all of this while staying relatively safe. You can call a car to pick you up with the touch of a button. You can text your friends to make sure everyone gets home okay. You can drink water between alcoholic beverages because you understand hydration. You can eat food specifically designed to slow alcohol absorption. You can take vitamins, use hangover remedies, and know that if something goes really wrong, there are hospitals with trained medical professionals who can help you. Medieval people who drank too much just had to suffer through whatever happened next. There was no medical understanding of alcohol poisoning, no treatments for overdose, no concept of harm reduction. You drank until you passed out, and you hoped you woke up the next morning. If you didn't, well, that was God's will. The social aspect of drinking has evolved too. Today, while peer pressure still exists, there's growing awareness of the importance of drinking responsibly. We have designated drivers, we have conversations about consent, we have an understanding that someone who's too drunk to make good decisions shouldn't be taken advantage of. These concepts would be completely foreign to medieval people. In medieval times, getting someone drunk was often a strategy. Drunk people were easier to cheat, easier to manipulate, easier to take advantage of. Business deals were made with drunk people. Marriages were arranged while people were intoxicated. Confessions were extracted from drunk prisoners. The idea that someone might be too drunk to consent to something was not just foreign, it was counterproductive to how society functioned. But perhaps most importantly, we have choices today that medieval people never had. If you don't want to drink, you don't have to. There are alcohol-free alternatives at every bar and restaurant. There are entire social movements built around not drinking. Society has evolved to the point where not drinking is seen as a personal choice rather than a moral failing or a sign of weakness. Medieval people didn't have this luxury. Ale was safer than water. Wine was a dietary staple. Not drinking wasn't really an option for most people. And if you chose not to drink for religious or personal reasons, you were often viewed with suspicion. What were you hiding? Why weren't you participating in the communal experience of getting intoxicated? The entertainment industry has also evolved to support drinking culture in ways that prioritize fun over destruction. Today's bars and clubs employ security staff trained in de-escalation techniques. They have protocols for handling overly intoxicated patrons. They work with law enforcement to ensure that problems are handled quickly and safely. They're businesses that want customers to have a good time and come back, not places where violence is expected and tolerated. This stands in stark contrast to medieval taverns, where the owner's main concern was selling as much alcohol as possible with minimal regard for the consequences. If customers killed each other, that was unfortunate, but it wasn't the tavern keeper's problem. If children were traumatized by what they witnessed, that was just part of growing up. If women were assaulted, that was between them and their attackers. The legal system today, while far from perfect, provides at least some framework for addressing alcohol-related crimes and misconduct. We have laws about public intoxication, about serving alcohol to minors, about what constitutes assault and battery. We have court systems that attempt to balance punishment with rehabilitation. We have the concept that being drunk isn't an excuse for criminal behavior, even if it might be a mitigating factor. Medieval justice was a completely different beast. The concept of due process barely existed. If you were accused of a crime while drunk, your punishment might depend on who you were, who you defended, and what mood the local lord was in that day. There were no standardized laws, no appeals process, no assumption of innocence until proven guilty. Justice was often swift, brutal, and final. And here's something that would seem impossible to medieval people. Today, we actually understand what alcohol does to the human body. We know about blood alcohol content, about liver function, about the difference between being tipsy and being dangerously intoxicated. We understand that alcohol affects judgment, coordination, and decision-making. We know that mixing alcohol with certain medications can be deadly. We have an entire medical specialty devoted to addiction and recovery. Medieval people understood that alcohol made you feel different, but they had no scientific framework for understanding why or how. They didn't know about neurons or neurotransmitters, or the way alcohol affects the brain's reward system. They couldn't distinguish between someone who was pleasantly drunk and someone who was on the verge of alcohol poisoning. They just knew that sometimes people drank and felt good, and sometimes they drank and died. This lack of understanding extended to treatment and recovery. Today, we have addiction counselors, support groups, medical interventions, and rehabilitation programs. We understand that alcoholism is a disease, not a moral failing. We have tools and techniques for helping people recover, for managing withdrawal, for rebuilding lives damaged by addiction. Medieval people who drank too much were simply considered weak, sinful, or cursed. There was no concept of addiction as a medical condition. There were no treatment programs, no support networks, no path to recovery. You either stopped drinking through sheer willpower, or you drank yourself to death. Those were the only options. The brewing and distilling industries today are marvels of science and artistry. Master brewers spend years learning their craft, understanding the complex chemistry of fermentation, the subtle interplay of ingredients, the precise timing required to create specific flavors and effects. Distillers age spirits for decades, monitoring and adjusting their products to achieve perfection. Winemakers study soil composition, climate patterns, and grape genetics to create wines that express the unique character of their region. Medieval brewing was mostly guesswork. You mixed some grain with water, added whatever yeast was floating around in the air, and hoped for the best. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it created something that would get you drunk. Sometimes it created something that would kill you. The process was inconsistent, unpredictable, and often dangerous. But let's talk about something that really highlights the difference between medieval and modern drinking culture: the concept of personal responsibility and harm reduction. Today, we have an understanding that while drinking can be fun and social, it also carries risks. We've developed strategies for minimizing those risks without eliminating the enjoyment. We pace ourselves. We eat before drinking. We alternate alcoholic beverages with water. We designate drivers or use ride-sharing services. We look out for our friends and make sure everyone gets home safely. We understand the signs of alcohol poisoning and know when to seek medical help. We have conversations about consent and make sure that everyone's having a good time voluntarily. These concepts were completely foreign to medieval people. The idea that you should limit your alcohol consumption to avoid negative consequences was not just unusual, it was counterproductive to the social function of drinking. Getting drunk wasn't something to be avoided or managed. It was the entire point. The more intoxicated you got, the more successful the evening was considered. Medieval feasts and celebrations were judged by how thoroughly everyone got drunk. A host who didn't provide enough alcohol for guests to become completely intoxicated was considered stingy or inhospitable. A guest who remained sober was viewed with suspicion. What were they plotting? Why weren't they participating in the communal experience of losing control? This created a culture where moderation was seen as antisocial, and excess was not just tolerated, but expected. People drank until they passed out, vomited, or became violent not because they had drinking problems, but because that's what you were supposed to do. It was normal. It was expected. It was the mark of a successful social gathering. The entertainment options available to drunk people today are also vastly superior to anything medieval people could imagine. We've created entire industries devoted to enhancing the drinking experience. Comedy clubs where professional comedians make us laugh until our sides hurt. Concert venues where we can see world-class musicians perform. Sports bars where we can watch games with other fans, sharing the excitement of victory and the agony of defeat. We have festivals devoted to beer, wine, and spirits, where we can sample products from around the world while enjoying music, food, and entertainment. We have themed bars that transport us to different times and places. Speakeasies that recreate the atmosphere of Prohibition-era America. Tiki bars that make us feel like we're on a tropical island. Irish pubs that celebrate Celtic culture and hospitality. Medieval people had the village tavern. That was it. One room, wooden benches, maybe a fireplace if they were lucky. The entertainment was whatever drunk people could come up with on their own, which usually meant singing, arguing, or fighting. There were no professional entertainers, no organized activities, no variety or choice. And yet, despite all these improvements, we still struggle with alcohol abuse in our modern world. The difference is that we recognize it as a problem and we're actively working to address it. We have research into addiction, prevention programs, treatment options, and support systems. We're constantly evolving our understanding and our approaches. Medieval people didn't even recognize alcohol abuse as a concept. Drinking to excess was normal. Drinking every day was normal. Drinking until you couldn't function was normal. The idea that someone might have a drinking problem was as foreign as the idea that someone might have a breathing problem or a sleeping problem. So, it was just part of life. The economic aspects of medieval drinking culture also created problems that we've largely solved today. In medieval times, alcohol was often used as currency. Workers were paid partially in ale. Taxes were sometimes paid in wine. This created a system where alcohol wasn't just a recreational substance, but an economic necessity. Today, while alcohol is certainly a major industry, we've separated it from our basic economic functions. You can't pay your rent with beer. Your employer can't pay you in wine. We've created clear boundaries between alcohol as entertainment and alcohol as economic necessity, which allows us to make more rational decisions about consumption. The religious aspects of drinking have also evolved significantly. Medieval Christianity had a complex relationship with alcohol. On one hand, wine was central to religious ceremonies, and Jesus himself was said to have turned water into wine. On the other hand, drunkenness was considered a sin, and monks were supposed to practice moderation. This created a contradictory system where alcohol was simultaneously sacred and sinful, necessary and forbidden. People were expected to drink, but not too much. They were supposed to enjoy God's gift of fermented beverages, but not to the point of losing control. These contradictions created guilt, confusion, and inconsistent enforcement of religious and social norms. Today, while different religions have different attitudes toward alcohol, we generally have clearer, more consistent guidelines. Some religions forbid alcohol entirely, others allow it in moderation, and still others have no restrictions at all. But most importantly, we have separation between religious and civil law, which means that religious rules about alcohol don't automatically become legal requirements. The medical understanding of alcohol has also revolutionized how we approach drinking. Today, we know that moderate alcohol consumption might have some health benefits, while excessive consumption is linked to numerous health problems. We can measure blood alcohol content, understand how alcohol affects different people differently, and provide medical treatment for alcohol-related conditions. Medieval people had no such understanding. They thought alcohol was generally good for you, that it helped with digestion, warmed the body, and prevented disease. They had no concept of alcoholism as a medical condition, no understanding of liver damage, and no ability to treat alcohol poisoning. People just drank until they felt better or until they died. This lack of medical knowledge meant that alcohol-related deaths were often attributed to other causes. Someone who died from liver failure might be said to have died from bad humours or God's will. Someone who died from alcohol poisoning might be said to have been cursed or possessed. The connection between excessive drinking and death was often not made at all. But perhaps most importantly, we've developed a culture today that allows for choice and variety in how we approach alcohol. You can be a social drinker, a craft beer enthusiast, a wine connoisseur, or a complete teetotaler, and all of these choices are socially acceptable. You can drink occasionally, regularly, or never, and each choice is respected. Medieval people had no such luxury. The social pressure to drink was enormous, and the consequences of not drinking could be severe. You might be excluded from social gatherings viewed as antisocial or suspicious, or even accused of being a heretic. Drinking wasn't a choice, it was a requirement for social acceptance. This social pressure was particularly intense for women, who were expected to be both modest and sociable, both controlled and participatory. A woman who drank too much was considered immoral, but a woman who didn't drink at all was considered antisocial. Finding the right balance was nearly impossible, and the consequences of getting it wrong could be severe. The technological advances that support modern drinking culture are also worth considering. We have refrigeration, which allows us to serve drinks at the perfect temperature. We have carbonation, which creates entirely new categories of beverages. We have precision instruments for measuring alcohol content, temperature, and timing. We have advanced filtration systems that ensure purity and consistency. Medieval people had barrels, jugs, and hope. They couldn't control temperature, couldn't ensure consistency, couldn't measure alcohol content, and couldn't prevent contamination. Every drink was a gamble, every barrel a mystery, every sip a potential surprise. The global nature of modern drinking culture also provides opportunities that medieval people couldn't imagine. We can drink sake from Japan, tequila from Mexico, vodka from Russia, and whiskey from Scotland, all in the same evening. We can experience the drinking traditions of dozens of cultures without leaving our own city. Medieval people were limited to whatever was produced locally. If you lived in a region that made good wine, you drank wine. If you lived in an area that brewed ale, you drank ale. If you lived somewhere that produced neither, you drank whatever was available and hoped it wouldn't kill you. This limited selection meant that medieval people never experienced the variety and creativity that we take for granted today. They never tasted a perfectly balanced cocktail, never experienced the complexity of a well-aged whiskey, never enjoyed the refreshing simplicity of a cold beer on a hot day. Their drinking experiences were limited, repetitive, and often unpleasant. But beyond all these practical improvements, perhaps the most important difference between medieval and modern drinking culture is the concept of consent and agency. Today, we understand that people should have control over their own bodies and their own choices. We recognize that forcing someone to drink or taking advantage of someone who's drunk is wrong. Medieval people had no such understanding. Consent was a foreign concept. Agency was limited. And taking advantage of drunk people was not just accepted but expected. The vulnerable had no protection. The weak had no advocates, and the consequences of this system were devastating for millions of people across centuries. So the next time you're out with friends, sipping a craft cocktail in a well-lit bar with security cameras and trained staff, remember that you're participating in a culture that has evolved over centuries to maximize enjoyment while minimizing harm. You're benefiting from advances in science, medicine, law, and social understanding that medieval people couldn't even imagine. You're living in a world where getting drunk can be fun, social, and relatively safe, rather than a dangerous gamble with your life, your safety, and your dignity. And that's something worth raising a glass to. But let's dig deeper into something that would make a medieval person's head spin: the sheer sophistication of how we approach intoxication today. In 2025, we don't just drink to get drunk. We drink to enhance experiences, to explore flavors, to connect with others, to celebrate achievements, to unwind after stressful days. We've turned alcohol consumption into an art form that medieval people couldn't even comprehend. Take the modern cocktail scene. Walk into any decent bar today, and you'll find bartenders who are essentially liquid chemists. They understand the molecular structure of different spirits, know how temperature affects flavor perception, can explain why certain combinations work while others don't. They're creating drinks with ingredients like activated charcoal, liquid nitrogen, and edible flowers. They're making cocktails that change color as you drink them, that smoke and bubble, that taste like childhood memories or distant places. Medieval people mixed ale with honey and called it mead. That was about as creative as it got. They didn't understand flavor profiles or balance or the way different ingredients interact. They just knew that fermented things made you feel funny, and that was good enough. But here's where it gets really interesting. We've created entire social rituals around drinking that medieval people never had. Wine tastings, where you learn to identify subtle notes of blackcurrant and oak. Beer festivals, where you can sample hundreds of different styles from around the world. Cocktail competitions, where bartenders compete to create the most innovative drinks. Distillery tours, where you can learn about the history and science behind your favorite spirits. These aren't just ways to consume alcohol. They're educational experiences, social events, cultural celebrations. We've elevated drinking from a basic human activity into something that can be intellectual, artistic, and deeply meaningful. Medieval people drank because they were thirsty, because the water was unsafe, because everyone else was drinking, because there was nothing else to do. The idea that you might drink to expand your palate, to learn about different cultures, to appreciate craftsmanship, or to have a meaningful conversation with friends would have been completely foreign to them. And speaking of conversations, let's talk about the social dynamics of modern drinking culture. Today, alcohol is often used as a social lubricant, something that helps people relax, open up, and connect with others. We go to wine bars for first dates, meet colleagues for after-work drinks, celebrate promotions with champagne. We've learned how to use alcohol to enhance social interactions rather than destroy them. Medieval social drinking was brutal. There was no concept of just having a couple or keeping it light. When medieval people got together to drink, they drank until they couldn't drink anymore. Period. The goal wasn't to have a pleasant evening with friends. It was to get as intoxicated as possible, as quickly as possible. This created a culture where social gatherings were less about connection and more about endurance. Who could drink the most? Who could stay conscious the longest? Who could still walk after everyone else had collapsed? These weren't celebrations. They were competitions with potentially deadly consequences, and the consequences were severe. Medieval records are full of accounts of people dying at social gatherings, not from violence or accidents, but from alcohol poisoning. People would drink themselves to death at weddings, festivals, and religious celebrations. This wasn't seen as a tragedy, it was seen as a sign that the party was successful. Compare that to today, where we have designated drivers, ride-sharing apps, and friends who look out for each other. We've created systems to ensure that fun doesn't turn into tragedy. We understand that the goal of social drinking is to enhance the experience, not to create casualties. The entertainment industry has also evolved to support responsible drinking in ways that medieval people couldn't imagine. Modern bars and clubs have trained staff who can recognize when someone has had too much and can intervene before things get dangerous. They have protocols for handling intoxicated patrons, relationships with local hospitals, and security systems to prevent violence. Medieval taverns were basically fight clubs with alcohol. The entertainment was watching people hurt each other. The staff's job was to keep the ale flowing, not to ensure anyone's safety. If someone got stabbed, beaten, or killed, that was just part of the evening's entertainment. But perhaps most importantly, we've developed a culture today that recognizes the difference between fun and abuse. We understand that alcohol can be enjoyable when used responsibly, but devastating when it's used to harm others. We have laws about consent, about domestic violence, about child protection. We have social services, police who are trained to handle domestic disputes, and shelters for people who need to escape dangerous situations. Medieval people had none of these protections. A husband who beat his wife while drunk wasn't committing a crime. He was exercising his rights. A father who abused his children while intoxicated wasn't a criminal. He was a patriarch maintaining order in his household. A lord who assaulted servants while drunk wasn't a predator. He was simply taking what was his. The legal system didn't protect the vulnerable because the concept of vulnerability didn't exist. Children were property. Women were property. Servants were property. And you could do whatever you wanted with your property, especially when you were drunk. This created a cycle of abuse that was reinforced by alcohol consumption. People who were victims of drunken violence had no recourse, no escape, no hope that things would get better. They just had to endure whatever happened and hope they survived until morning. And here's something that would blow a medieval mind. We actually have fun activities to do while drinking that don't involve violence or degradation. Karaoke, where you can sing your heart out and everyone cheers you on regardless of your talent level. Trivia nights, where you can test your knowledge while enjoying a beer with friends. Pool tournaments, dart competitions, dance floors with music that makes you want to move your body in ways that feel good. Medieval people had drinking songs, but they were mostly about death, disease, or religious themes. They had dancing, but it was formal, structured, and often interrupted by fights. They had games, but they usually involved gambling, cheating, or violence. The idea that you could have fun while drinking without someone getting hurt was revolutionary. The technological advances that support modern drinking culture are staggering when you think about it. We have sound systems that can make you feel like you're inside the music, lighting systems that create atmosphere and mood, air conditioning that keeps venues comfortable even when they're packed with people, security cameras that help prevent crime and provide evidence when crimes do occur. Medieval taverns were dark, smoky, poorly ventilated spaces where you could barely see who you were talking to. The only light came from candles or torches, which created more shadows than illumination. The air was thick with smoke, body odour and the smell of spilled ale. The floors were covered with rushes that soaked up spills, vomit and blood, creating a breeding ground for disease and vermin. But beyond the physical improvements, we've also developed a much more sophisticated understanding of alcohol's effects on the human body and mind. We know that different types of alcohol affect people differently. We understand that mixing drinks can be dangerous. We know that drinking on an empty stomach increases intoxication. We have hangover remedies, hydration strategies, and medical treatments for alcohol poisoning. Medieval people understood that alcohol made them feel different, but they had no scientific framework for understanding why or how. They didn't know about blood alcohol content, liver function, or the way alcohol affects the brain. They couldn't distinguish between being pleasantly buzzed and being dangerously intoxicated. This lack of understanding led to countless deaths that could have been prevented with basic knowledge. People would drink until they passed out, not realizing that they were in danger of dying from alcohol poisoning. They would mix different types of alcohol without understanding the cumulative effects. They would drink while sick, injured, or taking herbal remedies, not knowing that these combinations could be lethal. The brewing and distilling processes have also evolved dramatically. Today's alcoholic beverages are created using precise scientific methods that ensure consistency, purity, and safety. We have quality control measures, sanitation protocols, and regulatory oversight that prevent contamination and ensure that what you're drinking is what you think you're drinking. Medieval brewing was a crapshoot. The process was inconsistent, the results unpredictable, and the quality variable. One batch might be perfectly fine, while the next batch from the same brewer might be contaminated with dangerous bacteria or fungi. There was no way to test for safety, no standards to meet, no regulations to follow. This inconsistency meant that every drink was a gamble. You might get something that tasted good and gave you a pleasant buzz, or you might get something that made you violently ill or worse. Medieval people just accepted this as part of life, not realizing that things could be better. The social aspects of drinking have also evolved in ways that prioritize inclusion and safety. Today, we have designated driver programs, ride-sharing services, and public transportation that help people get home safely after drinking. We have friends who look out for each other, bars that stop serving people who've had too much, and medical professionals who understand how to treat alcohol-related emergencies. Medieval people had none of these safety nets. If you drank too much, you were on your own. If you couldn't get home, you might freeze to death in the street. If you were robbed or assaulted while drunk, that was your problem. There was no system in place to protect people from the consequences of their own intoxication or the predatory behavior of others. And let's talk about something that's really remarkable about modern drinking culture: the variety and creativity of alcohol-free alternatives. Today, if you don't want to drink alcohol, you have countless options. Sophisticated mocktails that are just as complex and delicious as their alcoholic counterparts. Craft sodas made with exotic ingredients and unique flavor combinations. Kombucha, cold-pressed juices, specialty teas, and coffee drinks that are works of art in themselves. Medieval people who didn't want to drink alcohol had water, which was often unsafe, or maybe milk, which spoiled quickly. That was it. The idea that you could have a sophisticated, enjoyable beverage experience without alcohol was inconceivable. This variety of options means that today's social drinking culture is more inclusive and accommodating than ever before. People who don't drink, whether for health reasons, religious beliefs, or personal preference, can still fully participate in social activities. They can go to bars, attend parties, and enjoy sophisticated beverages without feeling excluded or judged. The entertainment industry has also created amazing experiences that combine alcohol with other activities in ways that medieval people couldn't imagine. Dinner theatres, where you can enjoy wine while watching live performances. Painting classes, where you sip cocktails while creating art. Murder mystery events, where you solve crimes while enjoying themed drinks. Wine and cheese pairings that turn eating and drinking into an educational experience. Medieval people ate and drank, but they were separate activities. The idea that you could combine them in ways that enhanced both experiences was foreign to them. They didn't understand food and beverage pairings, didn't know that certain foods could complement or enhance certain drinks, and didn't have access to the variety of ingredients that make modern culinary experiences possible. But perhaps most importantly, we've developed a culture today that recognizes alcohol as just one option among many for having fun and socializing. You can have an amazing night out without drinking a drop of alcohol. You can go to concerts, movies, comedy shows, art galleries, sporting events, festivals, and countless other activities that don't revolve around alcohol consumption. Medieval people didn't have these options. Entertainment was limited, social activities were few, and alcohol was often the only way to make boring, difficult, or frightening situations bearable. People didn't drink because they wanted to. They drank because there was nothing else to do. This created a culture where alcohol wasn't just a beverage. It was a necessity for social functioning. People who didn't drink were excluded from social activities, viewed with suspicion, and often isolated from their communities. The social pressure to drink was enormous, and the consequences of not drinking could be severe. The economic aspects of modern drinking culture also provide benefits that medieval people couldn't imagine. Today's alcohol industry supports millions of jobs in brewing, distilling, distribution, retail, and hospitality. It generates tax revenue that funds public services. It creates opportunities for entrepreneurship and innovation. It contributes to tourism and cultural exchange. Medieval alcohol production was mostly small-scale, local, and economically insignificant. There was no global trade in alcoholic beverages, no major industry built around alcohol production, no economic incentive to improve quality or safety. People made what they could with what they had, and that was the end of it. This lack of economic incentive meant that there was no pressure to improve products, no competition to drive innovation, no investment in better equipment or techniques. Medieval alcohol remained primitive, dangerous, and unpleasant for centuries because there was no economic reason to make it better. The medical understanding of alcohol has also revolutionized how we approach drinking. Today, we know that moderate alcohol consumption might have some health benefits, while excessive consumption is linked to numerous health problems. We can measure blood alcohol content, understand how alcohol affects different people differently, and provide medical treatment for alcohol-related conditions. We have addiction counselors, support groups, rehabilitation programs, and medical interventions for people who struggle with alcohol abuse. We understand that alcoholism is a disease, not a moral failing, and we have tools and techniques for helping people recover. Medieval people had no such understanding or resources. Someone who drank too much was considered weak, sinful, or cursed. There was no concept of addiction as a medical condition, no treatment programs, no support networks. You either stopped drinking through willpower or you drank yourself to death. The legal framework surrounding alcohol has also evolved to balance personal freedom with public safety. We have age restrictions that protect young people from alcohol's harmful effects. We have laws about driving under the influence, about serving alcohol to intoxicated people, and about what constitutes assault and battery. We have court systems that attempt to balance punishment with rehabilitation. Medieval legal systems were chaotic, inconsistent, and often brutal. There were no standardized laws about alcohol, no consistent enforcement, no appeals process. Justice was often swift, arbitrary, and final. Being drunk might excuse your behavior, or it might make your punishment worse, depending on who you were and who you defended. But perhaps most remarkably, we've created a culture today that allows people to make informed choices about alcohol consumption. We have education about the risks and benefits of drinking. We have resources for people who want to quit or reduce their consumption. We have social support for people who choose not to drink at all. Medieval people had no such luxury. They drank because everyone drank, because it was expected, because there were no alternatives. The idea that someone might make an informed, personal choice about alcohol consumption was foreign to them. This ability to choose, to be informed, to have options. These are luxuries that medieval people couldn't even imagine. They lived in a world where alcohol was both necessary and dangerous, where drinking was both required and potentially lethal, where the only choice was how much to drink, not whether to drink at all. So the next time you're deciding between a craft beer and a specialty cocktail, or choosing to stick with water because you're the designated driver, remember that you're exercising freedoms that countless generations of people never had. You're participating in a culture that has evolved over centuries to maximize enjoyment while minimizing harm, to provide options rather than requirements, to support rather than exploit. You're living in a world where getting drunk can be a choice rather than a necessity, where it can be fun rather than dangerous, where it can bring people together rather than tear them apart. And that transformation from the nightmare of medieval drinking culture to the sophisticated, varied, and relatively safe options we have today represents one of humanity's greatest achievements in learning how to balance pleasure with responsibility, freedom with safety, and individual choice with collective well-being. And yet, for all our progress, we still haven't fully grasped just how fundamentally different the medieval relationship with alcohol was from our own. Today, when someone has too much to drink, we have protocols, we have systems, we have the luxury of consequences that don't immediately end in death or permanent disability. Picture this: you're at a modern bar and someone's clearly had too much. What happens? The bartender cuts them off. Security steps in. Friends intervene. Maybe they get an Uber home, drink some water, take some aspirin, and wake up embarrassed but alive. The worst-case scenario might involve a trip to the emergency room, where trained medical professionals can pump their stomach, provide IV fluids, and monitor their vital signs until they're stable. Now imagine the same scenario in medieval times. Someone drinks too much at the village tavern. There's no one to cut them off because the concept doesn't exist. There's no security because violence is expected. There's no medical intervention because medical knowledge barely extends beyond maybe this herb will help, maybe it won't. The person either wakes up the next morning or they don't. And if they don't, everyone just shrugs and moves on with their lives. But here's what's truly chilling about medieval drinking culture: the complete absence of any understanding that alcohol could be a problem in the first place. Today, we have terms like binge drinking, alcohol poisoning, addiction, and alcohol abuse, all. We recognize these as medical conditions that require intervention. We have entire medical specialties devoted to treating alcohol-related problems. Medieval people had no such vocabulary. They had no concept that someone could drink too much in any meaningful sense. They understood that excessive drinking could make you sick, sure, but they attributed that to personal weakness, divine punishment, or bad luck. The idea that alcohol itself could be toxic, that there were safe limits, that someone could become physically dependent on it. These concepts were as foreign to them as quantum physics. This ignorance created a culture where what we would today recognize as severe alcoholism was just considered normal behavior. Someone who drank from morning until night, who couldn't function without alcohol, who became violent or abusive when intoxicated, that wasn't seen as a person with a medical condition who needed help. That was just how some people were. And the social reinforcement of this behavior was absolute. If you could drink a lot without passing out, you were admired. If you could function while heavily intoxicated, you were respected. If you could outdrink your peers, you were celebrated. The very behaviors that we now recognize as signs of serious alcohol problems were seen as virtues in medieval society. The impact on families was devastating in ways that are hard for us to comprehend today. Imagine being a child in a household where your father drinks heavily every single day, where your mother has no legal recourse when he becomes violent, where the entire social structure reinforces the idea that this is normal and acceptable. There's no child protective services to call, no shelters to flee to, no legal system that recognizes domestic violence as a crime. You just endure it, day after day, year after year, until you're old enough to leave home and likely repeat the same patterns because that's all you've ever known. The cycle of abuse perpetuated itself across generations because there was no framework for understanding that things could be different. The economic impact of this uncontrolled drinking culture was staggering. Today, we talk about the economic costs of alcohol abuse, lost productivity, healthcare expenses, crime-related costs. But at least we have systems in place to measure and address these problems. We have workplace policies about drinking, employee assistance programs, and legal protections for workers who seek treatment for alcohol problems. Medieval economies were built around the assumption that a significant portion of the population would be functioning alcoholics. Agricultural work, the backbone of medieval society, was structured around the reality that workers would be drinking throughout the day. Harvest time, when the work was most critical, was also when drinking was most intense. The economic inefficiency was enormous, but no one recognized it as a problem because there was no alternative framework for understanding productivity. Craftsmen, merchants, and artisans all worked while drinking. The quality of their work suffered, but quality control was minimal anyway. A blacksmith who made subpar horseshoes because he was drunk, a baker who burned bread because he was intoxicated, a weaver who produced flawed cloth because he couldn't see straight. These weren't seen as alcohol-related problems. They were just accepted as part of the normal variation in human performance. The religious implications were equally complex and contradictory. Christianity taught that drunkenness was a sin, but wine was central to the most sacred religious ceremony. Monks brewed ale and made wine, but they were also supposed to practice moderation. The Church condemned excessive drinking while simultaneously blessing the production and consumption of alcohol. This created a theological pretzel that medieval people had to navigate daily. When was drinking acceptable? When did it become sinful? How much was too much? The answers varied depending on who you asked, what day it was, and what the political climate was like. The result was a population that felt simultaneously guilty about drinking and compelled to continue doing it. But, perhaps most tragically, medieval drinking culture robbed people of the ability to experience genuine joy and connection. Today, we use alcohol to enhance experiences, to celebrate achievements, to bond with friends, to mark special occasions. We understand that alcohol can be a social lubricant that helps people relax and connect with each other. Medieval people drank to escape. They drank to forget their problems, to numb their pain, to make unbearable situations bearable. They didn't drink to enhance their lives. They drank to survive their lives. The difference is profound and heartbreaking. Imagine never experiencing the simple pleasure of sharing a well-crafted cocktail with friends while discussing something you're passionate about. Imagine never tasting a perfect wine that complements a delicious meal. Imagine never having a beer while watching your favorite team play, feeling connected to thousands of other fans sharing the same experience. Medieval people had none of these experiences. They had ale that tasted like liquid bread, wine that was often sour or contaminated, and mead that was cloyingly sweet. They drank these things not because they enjoyed them, but because they were the only options available. The concept of drinking for pleasure, rather than necessity or obligation, was completely foreign. The technological limitations of medieval brewing and distilling meant that consistency was impossible. Every batch was different, every barrel was a gamble, every drink was a potential surprise. You might get something that was merely unpleasant, or you might get something that was actively dangerous. There was no way to know until you drank it. This uncertainty extended to every aspect of medieval drinking culture. You never knew if the ale you were drinking was safe, if the wine was contaminated, if the mead was properly fermented. You never knew if the person sitting next to you would become violent when drunk, if the tavern keeper was cheating you, if the local lord would show up and demand tribute. The stress of living in such an unpredictable environment was enormous, and alcohol was the only available coping mechanism. People drank not because they wanted to, but because they needed to. It was the only way to make an unbearable situation tolerable, even if it came with its own set of dangers and consequences. The gender dynamics of medieval drinking culture were particularly brutal. Women were expected to be both accessible and virtuous, both participatory and controlled. They were supposed to drink enough to be sociable, but not so much that they lost their virtue. They were supposed to serve alcohol to men, but not enjoy it themselves. They were supposed to tolerate the consequences of men's drinking, but never complain about it. The contradictions were impossible to navigate successfully. A woman who drank too little was considered antisocial or suspicious. A woman who drank too much was considered immoral or dangerous. A woman who complained about her husband's drinking was considered disobedient. A woman who enabled her husband's drinking was considered complicit in his sins. There was no winning, no safe choice, no option that didn't carry significant risks. Women simply had to navigate these contradictions as best they could, knowing that any choice they made could result in punishment, abandonment, or worse. The impact on children was equally devastating. Today, we understand that children exposed to alcohol abuse suffer from trauma, developmental delays, and increased risk of addiction later in life. We have programs to identify and help these children, therapies to address their trauma, and legal protections to remove them from dangerous situations. Medieval children had no such protections. They were exposed to constant alcohol abuse, witnessed violence and degradation daily, and learned that these behaviors were normal and acceptable. They had no concept that their experiences were traumatic because trauma wasn't understood as a psychological condition. These children grew up to become adults who perpetuated the same patterns of abuse and neglect. They drank heavily because that's what adults did. They became violent when intoxicated because that's what they had learned. They neglected their own children because that's how they had been raised. The cycle was self-perpetuating and seemingly unbreakable. Generation after generation of people lived and died without ever experiencing healthy relationships with alcohol, without ever learning that things could be different, without ever having the opportunity to break free from the patterns that had been established centuries before they were born. The medical consequences of medieval drinking culture were catastrophic. Today, we know that chronic alcohol abuse can cause liver disease, heart problems, brain damage, and increased risk of cancer. We have treatments for these conditions, prevention programs to reduce the risk, and early intervention strategies to help people before the damage becomes irreversible. Medieval people had no such knowledge or resources. They died from alcohol-related diseases without ever understanding what had killed them. They suffered from conditions that we now know are preventable and treatable, but they attributed their suffering to God's will, bad luck, or personal weakness. The life expectancy of heavy drinkers in medieval times was shockingly low, even by the standards of the era. While the average person might live to their 30s or 40s, chronic alcoholics often died in their 20s or even younger. Their deaths were rarely attributed to alcohol, but the correlation was clear to anyone who cared to look. But perhaps most tragically, medieval drinking culture prevented people from reaching their full potential as human beings. Today, we recognize that alcohol abuse can rob people of their creativity, their intelligence, their ability to form meaningful relationships, their capacity for personal growth. We have programs to help people recover these aspects of themselves, to rebuild their lives, to discover who they might have been without alcohol. Medieval people who might have been artists, inventors, leaders, or innovators instead spent their lives in an alcoholic haze, their potential unrealized and unrecognized. How many great works of art were never created? How many scientific discoveries were never made? How many acts of compassion and kindness were never performed? The loss to human civilization is incalculable. The social structures of medieval society were built around the assumption that this was simply how people were, that heavy drinking and its consequences were inevitable and unchangeable. There was no vision of a different way of living, no hope for improvement, no belief that things could be better. This resignation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of medieval drinking culture. It wasn't just that people suffered, it was that they accepted their suffering as natural and inevitable. They didn't fight against the system because they couldn't imagine an alternative. They didn't seek help because they didn't believe help was possible. The contrast with our modern world is stark and hopeful. Today we know that addiction is treatable, that recovery is possible, that people can change. We have proof that societies can evolve, that harmful practices can be abandoned, that progress is achievable. We have examples of people who have overcome severe alcohol problems and gone on to live fulfilling, productive lives. We have communities that support recovery, workplaces that accommodate treatment, families that understand addiction as a disease rather than a moral failing. We have medications that can help with withdrawal, therapies that can address underlying trauma, and support groups that provide ongoing encouragement and accountability. Most importantly, we have hope. We believe that things can get better, that people can change, that suffering is not inevitable. This hope, more than any specific program or intervention, is what makes recovery possible. It's what drives innovation in treatment, what motivates people to seek help, what sustains them through the difficult process of change. Medieval people had no such hope. They lived in a world where suffering was expected, where change was impossible, where the only escape from pain was temporary oblivion. They couldn't imagine a world where alcohol could be enjoyed responsibly, where drinking could be a choice rather than a compulsion, where people could find joy and connection without sacrificing their health and dignity. But we can imagine such a world because we live in it. We've created it, slowly and imperfectly, over centuries of struggle and progress. We've learned from the mistakes of the past, built on the insights of previous generations, and created systems that, while not perfect, are infinitely better than what came before. The next time you're out with friends, enjoying a craft beer or a carefully crafted cocktail, surrounded by people who care about your well-being, and in a place where your safety is protected by law and custom, take a moment to appreciate the remarkable achievement that represents. You're participating in a culture that has learned to balance pleasure with responsibility, freedom with safety, individual choice with collective well-being. You're living in a world where getting drunk can be fun rather than dangerous, where it can bring people together rather than tear them apart, where it can enhance experiences rather than destroy them. And that transformation, from the nightmare of medieval drinking culture to the sophisticated, varied, and relatively safe options we have today, represents one of humanity's greatest achievements in learning how to live well. The journey from medieval drinking culture to modern drinking culture is ultimately a story about human progress. It's about our capacity to learn from our mistakes, to build better systems, to create more humane ways of living. It's about the slow, difficult work of civilization, the gradual process of making life better for each successive generation. We still have work to do. Alcohol abuse remains a serious problem in our society. Domestic violence, drunk driving, and addiction continue to cause suffering and death. But we've made enormous progress, and we continue to make progress every day. We've proven that change is possible, that suffering can be reduced, that people can learn to live better lives. The medieval world couldn't imagine the sophisticated, safe, and enjoyable drinking culture we have today. Perhaps our descendants will look back at our current practices with the same mixture of horror and pity that we feel when we consider medieval drinking culture. Perhaps they'll have developed even better ways of balancing pleasure with responsibility, even more effective treatments for addiction, even safer and more enjoyable ways of socializing and celebrating. If so, they'll be building on the foundation we're laying today, just as we've built on the foundation laid by previous generations. The story of human progress is a story of incremental improvements, of small steps forward, of the gradual accumulation of knowledge and wisdom over time. So raise your glass, if you choose to the long journey from medieval nightmare to modern possibility. Toast the countless people who suffered and died so that we might learn better ways of living. Celebrate the fact that you have choices they never had, options they couldn't imagine, and freedoms they died without ever experiencing. And remember that the work isn't finished. There are still people suffering from alcohol abuse, still families torn apart by addiction, still communities struggling with the consequences of unhealthy drinking culture. The progress we've made gives us hope that further progress is possible, that the future can be even better than the present. The transformation from medieval drinking culture to modern drinking culture is proof that human beings can learn, can grow, can change. It's evidence that suffering is not inevitable, that progress is possible, that each generation can build a better world for the next. And in a world that often feels dark and hopeless, that's a message worth remembering, worth celebrating, and worth sharing with others. The story of how we learn to drink better is ultimately the story of how we learn to live better. And that's a story that's still being written, one choice at a time, one generation at a time, one person at a time. The transformation of drinking culture becomes even more striking when you consider the entertainment landscape that medieval people had to work with. Today, if you want to have a good time while drinking, you have an almost overwhelming array of options. You can go to a comedy club and laugh until your sides hurt while sipping a perfectly crafted old-fashioned. You can attend a wine tasting where experts guide you through the subtle differences between vintages while you learn about soil composition and weather patterns. You can dance at a club where the music is so perfectly engineered that it seems to sync with your heartbeat, where the lights create an otherworldly atmosphere, where the entire experience is designed to make you feel like you're part of something magical. Medieval people had the village drunk, singing the same 3 songs he'd known since childhood, assuming he could still remember the words. That was it. That was the entertainment. Maybe someone would tell a story about a saint being martyred in particularly creative ways, or perhaps a travelling minstrel would show up with news from the next village over, which usually involved someone dying from the plague or getting eaten by wolves. The idea that entertainment could be sophisticated, varied, or actually entertaining was about as foreign to them as the concept of indoor plumbing. But here's where it gets really interesting. We've created entire industries around making alcohol consumption safer and more enjoyable. Take the modern bartending profession. Today's bartenders aren't just people who pour drinks. They're skilled professionals who understand the science of flavor, the art of presentation, and the psychology of hospitality. They know how to recognize when someone's had too much, how to de-escalate potentially dangerous situations, and how to create an atmosphere where people can relax and have fun without things getting out of hand. They're trained in responsible service, they understand liability, and they're part of a system that prioritizes customer safety alongside customer satisfaction. The best bartenders today are like therapists with liquor licenses. They listen to your problems, offer gentle advice, and make sure you get home safely at the end of the night. Medieval tavern keepers were basically drug dealers with fewer scruples. Their job was to sell as much alcohol as possible to anyone with money, regardless of age, sobriety level, or likelihood of surviving the experience. If you died in their establishment, they drag your body outside and get back to serving the next customer. Customer service meant keeping the ale flowing, not keeping the customers breathing. And speaking of breathing, let's talk about the physical environment of medieval drinking establishments. Today's bars and clubs are marvels of engineering designed to keep people comfortable and safe. They have ventilation systems that prevent carbon dioxide buildup, fire suppression systems that can respond to emergencies in seconds, and lighting that's bright enough to see but dim enough to create atmosphere. They have bathrooms that are cleaned regularly, floors that are mopped nightly, and surfaces that are sanitized between customers. Medieval taverns were basically caves with alcohol. The air was thick with smoke from poorly ventilated fireplaces, the smell of unwashed bodies, and the lingering aroma of whatever had died in the walls. The floors were covered with rushes that were supposed to absorb spills, but mainly just created a breeding ground for vermin and disease. The lighting came from candles or torches that created more shadows than illumination and posed a constant fire hazard in buildings made entirely of wood and thatch. Going to a medieval tavern was like entering a biological weapon disguised as a social gathering. You were more likely to catch a disease than catch a buzz, and the diseases available were varied and creative. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and a dozen other ailments that modern medicine has relegated to history textbooks were just part of the tavern experience. But let's talk about something that would absolutely blow a medieval mind: the concept of themed drinking experiences. Today, you can go to a speakeasy that recreates the atmosphere of Prohibition-era America, complete with hidden entrances, jazz music, and cocktails served in teacups. You can visit a tiki bar that transports you to a tropical paradise with bamboo decorations, exotic drinks served in carved coconuts, and music that makes you feel like you're on a beach in Polynesia. You can attend a medieval-themed restaurant where actors in period costume serve you while performing scenes from history. And the irony is that these recreations are infinitely more pleasant than the actual medieval experience would have been. Medieval people had the medieval experience, and it sucked. They didn't need to recreate it because they were living it. And what they were living was cold, dirty, dangerous, and deeply unpleasant. The idea that future generations would pay money to pretend to live like them would have been incomprehensible, like paying to experience the plague or pretending to be a serf for entertainment. The social dynamics of modern drinking culture are also worth examining. Today, we have elaborate social rituals around alcohol that serve to build community, celebrate achievements, and mark important life events. Bachelor and bachelorette parties, work happy hours, wine and cheese nights, beer festivals, cocktail competitions. These are all ways that we've learned to use alcohol as a tool for social bonding rather than social destruction. We've created customs and traditions that help people connect with each other in meaningful ways. We toast to celebrate successes. We share drinks to mark friendships. We use alcohol as a way to relax and open up to others. The alcohol itself is just one component of a larger social experience that includes conversation, laughter, shared experiences, and mutual support. Medieval social drinking was more like a battle royale with ale. People drank together not to bond, but to compete. Who could drink the most? Who could stay conscious the longest? Who could fight the best while intoxicated? The alcohol wasn't a tool for connection. It was a weapon for establishing dominance. Social gatherings weren't about community. They were about survival. And the consequences of this competitive drinking culture were severe. Medieval records are filled with accounts of people dying at social events, not from violence or accidents, but from alcohol poisoning. Wedding celebrations where the groom died before the ceremony was over. Harvest festivals where half the participants didn't make it home. Religious holidays where people literally drank themselves to death in honor of God. These weren't isolated incidents. They were predictable outcomes of a culture that viewed extreme intoxication as a mark of success rather than a sign of problems. The more people died at your party, the more successful it was considered. The more casualties your celebration created, the more memorable it became. Compare that to modern party culture, where the goal is for everyone to have a good time and go home safely. We have designated drivers, we look out for our friends, we call for help when someone's in trouble. We've learned that the best parties are the ones where everyone survives to tell the story. But perhaps most remarkably, we've developed a sophisticated understanding of how alcohol affects different people differently. Today, we know that factors like body weight, gender, food consumption, medications, and genetic predisposition all influence how alcohol affects an individual. We understand that what might be a pleasant buzz for one person could be dangerous intoxication for another. We've learned to personalize our approach to alcohol consumption. Some people can handle more, some people need to be more careful, some people should avoid alcohol entirely. We've developed strategies for helping people understand their own limits and make informed decisions about their consumption. Medieval people had no such understanding. They operated on the assumption that alcohol affected everyone the same way, and that if you couldn't keep up with the group, you were weak or defective. There was no recognition that people might have different tolerances, different health conditions, or different needs when it came to alcohol consumption. This one-size-fits-all approach to drinking led to countless tragedies. People with low alcohol tolerance were forced to drink amounts that made them violently ill or worse. People with health conditions that made alcohol dangerous had no way of knowing they should avoid it. People who were taking herbal remedies or other substances had no understanding of potential interactions. The result was a culture where alcohol-related deaths were common and accepted. People died at social gatherings, and everyone just shrugged and moved on. It was seen as bad luck or divine will, not as a preventable tragedy caused by ignorance and poor decision-making. The technological advances that support modern drinking culture extend far beyond just the production of alcohol itself. We have entire industries devoted to making drinking safer and more enjoyable. Ride-sharing companies that help people get home safely. Food delivery services that bring late-night snacks to help with alcohol absorption. Apps that can track your consumption and remind you to pace yourself. We have breathalyzers that can tell you exactly how intoxicated you are, hangover remedies that can help you feel better the next day, and medical treatments that can address alcohol poisoning if things go wrong. We've created a comprehensive support system around alcohol consumption that prioritizes safety and enjoyment. Medieval people had none of these technologies. If you drank too much, you were on your own. If you needed to get home, you had to walk. And if you couldn't walk, you might not make it. If you were poisoned by contaminated alcohol, there was no treatment available. If you developed a hangover, you just had to suffer through it. The legal framework surrounding alcohol has also evolved dramatically. Today, we have complex laws that balance personal freedom with public safety. We have age restrictions that protect young people from alcohol's harmful effects. We have regulations that ensure quality and safety in alcohol production. We have criminal laws that punish people who harm others while intoxicated. But perhaps most importantly, we have civil laws that provide recourse for people who are harmed by others drinking. If someone injures you while drunk, you can sue them. If a bar serves alcohol to someone who's clearly intoxicated and that person causes harm, the bar can be held liable. If an employer allows drinking that creates a hostile work environment, they can be prosecuted. Medieval people had no such legal protections. If someone hurt you while drunk, that was between you and them. If a tavern keeper served poisoned ale, that was your problem. If your employer forced you to drink as part of your job, you had no recourse. The legal system didn't recognize alcohol-related harm as something that deserved compensation or punishment. This lack of legal protection meant that the vulnerable had no recourse when alcohol-related harm occurred. Children who were abused by drunk parents had no one to turn to. Women who were assaulted by intoxicated men had no legal standing to seek justice. Workers who were injured by drunk colleagues had no way to seek compensation. The education system has also evolved to support responsible drinking in ways that medieval people couldn't imagine. Today, we teach young people about the risks and benefits of alcohol consumption. We provide information about safe drinking practices, the signs of alcohol poisoning, and the resources available for people who need help. We have driver's education programs that emphasize the dangers of drunk driving. We have health classes that explain how alcohol affects the body and mind. We have substance abuse programs that help people understand the difference between use and abuse. Medieval people had no such education. They learned about alcohol by watching others drink and by experiencing the consequences firsthand. There was no systematic effort to teach people about safe consumption, no understanding of the risks involved, no recognition that education could prevent harm. This lack of education meant that people made the same mistakes over and over again. They drank contaminated alcohol because they didn't know how to identify it. They mixed different types of alcohol because they didn't understand the cumulative effects. They drank while sick or injured because they didn't know it could make things worse. The result was a cycle of ignorance and harm that perpetuated itself across generations. People learned bad habits from their parents, passed those habits on to their children, and never questioned whether there might be better ways to approach alcohol consumption. But let's talk about something that's truly revolutionary about modern drinking culture: the concept of moderation and self-control. Today, we understand that alcohol can be enjoyed responsibly, that it's possible to drink without getting drunk, that moderation is not only acceptable, but admirable. We have social norms that support responsible drinking. We respect people who know their limits and stick to them. We admire people who can have a good time without losing control. We've learned that the goal of drinking isn't to get as intoxicated as possible, but to enhance the experience while maintaining dignity and safety. Medieval people had no such concept. The idea that you might drink just enough to feel good without getting completely wasted was foreign to them. The goal was always to drink until you couldn't drink anymore. Moderation was seen as failure. Self-control was viewed as weakness, and anyone who didn't drink to excess was considered antisocial or suspicious. This cultural pressure to drink excessively created a society where alcohol abuse was not just tolerated, but expected. People who might have been able to drink responsibly were forced to participate in dangerous drinking practices. People who recognized that they had problems with alcohol had no support for addressing those problems. The entertainment industry has also created amazing experiences that enhance alcohol consumption without making it the primary focus. Today, you can attend wine tastings that are educational experiences, beer festivals that celebrate craftsmanship, cocktail competitions that showcase creativity and skill. These events use alcohol as a starting point for broader cultural experiences. We've learned to create environments where alcohol enhances the experience rather than defining it. The focus is on learning, socializing, celebrating, and connecting with others. The alcohol is just one component of a larger experience that includes education, entertainment, and community. Medieval people had no such sophisticated approach to alcohol-related entertainment. Their drinking events were focused solely on consumption, with no educational component, no celebration of craftsmanship, no effort to create meaningful experiences. The goal was simply to get drunk as quickly and thoroughly as possible. The result was entertainment that was neither entertaining nor safe. People gathered to drink, got intoxicated, and then either fought, passed out, or died. There was no effort to create positive experiences, no recognition that alcohol could be part of something larger and more meaningful. The global nature of modern drinking culture also provides experiences that medieval people couldn't imagine. Today, you can sample sake from Japan, tequila from Mexico, whiskey from Scotland, and vodka from Russia, all in the same evening. You can learn about different cultures through their drinking traditions, explore history through their brewing techniques, and connect with people from around the world through shared appreciation for their beverages. We've created a global community around alcohol that celebrates diversity, craftsmanship, and cultural exchange. We use alcohol as a way to explore the world, to learn about different traditions, to connect with people from different backgrounds. Medieval people were limited to whatever was produced locally. They had no access to international beverages, no understanding of different cultural traditions, no opportunity to explore the world through its drinking customs. Their alcohol experiences were narrow, limited, and repetitive. This isolation meant that they never experienced the variety and complexity that we take for granted today. They never tasted a perfectly balanced cocktail, never experienced the subtle differences between regional wines, never enjoyed the unique flavors of spirits from different countries. The social support systems that exist today around alcohol consumption are also remarkable. We have friends who look out for each other, designated driver programs, ride-sharing services, and emergency medical care. We've created multiple layers of protection to ensure that people can enjoy alcohol safely. We have support groups for people who struggle with alcohol, treatment programs for those who need help, and legal protections for those who are harmed by others drinking. We've built a comprehensive system that recognizes alcohol as both a source of pleasure and a potential danger. Medieval people had no such support systems. They were entirely on their own when it came to alcohol consumption and its consequences. There was no one to call for help, no programs to address problems, no legal recourse for harm caused by others drinking. This lack of support meant that people who struggled with alcohol had no options for recovery. They either quit drinking through willpower alone, or they drank themselves to death. There was no middle ground, no gradual improvement, no professional help available. The result was a culture where alcohol problems were permanent and fatal. People who developed drinking problems were written off as hopeless cases, abandoned by their families and communities, and left to die alone and forgotten. But perhaps most importantly, we've developed a culture today that recognizes the difference between use and abuse, between enjoyment and addiction, between social drinking and destructive drinking. We understand that alcohol can be part of a healthy lifestyle when used responsibly, and we have systems in place to help people who struggle with responsible use. This nuanced understanding allows us to approach alcohol in ways that maximize benefits while minimizing risks. We can enjoy the social aspects of drinking while avoiding the dangers of excessive consumption. We can appreciate the craftsmanship and artistry of alcoholic beverages while maintaining our health and dignity. Medieval people had no such nuanced understanding. They saw alcohol as either good or bad, with no middle ground. They couldn't conceive of responsible use, couldn't imagine enjoying alcohol without getting drunk, couldn't understand that moderation might be more pleasurable than excess. This black and white thinking created a culture where alcohol was either completely embraced or completely rejected, with no room for the kind of balanced approach that makes modern drinking culture possible. People either drank excessively or not at all, with no recognition that there might be better options available. The transformation from medieval drinking culture to modern drinking culture represents one of humanity's greatest achievements in learning how to balance pleasure with responsibility, freedom with safety, and individual choice with collective well-being. We've proven that it's possible to create systems that allow people to enjoy alcohol safely, that support those who struggle with consumption, and that protect the vulnerable from harm. This progress didn't happen overnight. It took centuries of trial and error, countless tragedies, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge and wisdom. But we've proven that change is possible, that cultures can evolve, and that human suffering can be reduced through intelligent policy and social innovation. The medieval world couldn't imagine the sophisticated, safe, and enjoyable drinking culture we have today. They lived in a world where alcohol was both necessary and dangerous, where drinking was both required and potentially fatal, where the only choices were excess or abstinence. We've created a world where alcohol can be a source of pleasure rather than pain, where drinking can bring people together rather than tear them apart, where consumption can be a choice rather than a compulsion. And that transformation represents hope for continued progress in all areas of human experience. The next time you're enjoying a craft cocktail with friends, surrounded by safety measures and support systems that medieval people couldn't imagine, remember that you're participating in one of humanity's greatest success stories. You're benefiting from centuries of progress, innovation, and hard-won wisdom about how to live well. You're living in a world where the nightmares of medieval drinking culture have been replaced by the possibilities of modern drinking culture. And that's something worth celebrating, responsibly, of course. But what truly separates our modern drinking world from the medieval nightmare is something even more fundamental: the concept of choice itself. Today, when you decide to drink, you're making a conscious decision based on information, preferences, and circumstances. You might choose a light beer because you have to drive later, or opt for a glass of wine because it pairs well with your dinner, or select a craft cocktail because you want to try something new and exciting. Medieval people didn't have choices. They had obligations. You drank because it was expected, because it was safer than water, because refusing meant social exile or worse. The idea that someone might evaluate their options, consider their circumstances, and make an informed decision about alcohol consumption was as foreign to them as the idea of traveling to the moon. This lack of choice extended to every aspect of their drinking experience. They couldn't choose what to drink. They drank whatever was available. They couldn't choose when to drink. They drank when everyone else was drinking. They couldn't choose how much to drink. They drank until the alcohol ran out or they passed out. They couldn't choose where to drink. They drank wherever alcohol was being served, regardless of safety or comfort. The psychological impact of this lack of choice was devastating. When you can't make decisions about your own consumption, you lose a fundamental sense of control over your life. You become passive, reactive, helpless. You stop thinking of yourself as someone who has agency and start thinking of yourself as someone who just endures whatever happens. This learned helplessness extended far beyond alcohol consumption. People who couldn't make choices about drinking also couldn't make choices about other aspects of their lives. They accepted abuse because they had no framework for believing they deserved better. They tolerated dangerous conditions because they had no experience with advocating for themselves. They lived in misery because they had no practice with imagining alternatives. Today's drinking culture, by contrast, is built on the foundation of personal autonomy. We recognize that adults should have the right to make their own decisions about alcohol consumption, and we've created systems that support informed decision-making. We provide education about the effects of alcohol, information about safe consumption practices, and resources for people who want to change their drinking habits. We've also developed social norms that respect individual choices. If someone doesn't want to drink, we don't pressure them. If someone wants to leave early, we support them. If someone needs help with their drinking, we connect them with resources. We've learnt that respecting individual autonomy actually makes the entire social experience better for everyone. But let's talk about something that would make a medieval person's head spin: the sheer variety of alcohol-related experiences available today. In 2025, you can attend a whiskey tasting where you learn about the differences between single malt and blended scotch. You can take a brewery tour where you see how beer is made from grain to glass. You can participate in a wine harvest where you actually help pick grapes and learn about the winemaking process. You can attend cocktail classes where professional bartenders teach you how to make drinks at home. You can visit distilleries where you can see how spirits are made and aged. You can go to beer festivals where you can sample hundreds of different styles from around the world. You can participate in wine clubs where you receive carefully curated selections delivered to your door with detailed tasting notes and food pairing suggestions. Medieval people had ale, wine, and mead. That was it. 3 options, all of which were inconsistent, often contaminated, and frequently unpalatable. The idea that you could spend an entire evening learning about the subtle differences between different types of alcohol, or that you could make a hobby out of exploring different beverages, was completely inconceivable. This variety has created an entire culture around alcohol appreciation. that treats beverages as art forms, worthy of study and discussion. We have sommeliers who spend years learning to identify subtle flavors and aromas in wine. We have cicerones who specialize in beer knowledge. We have mixologists who create cocktails that are literally works of art. These professionals have elevated alcohol consumption from a basic human activity to a sophisticated cultural experience. They've shown us that drinking can be intellectual, creative, and deeply rewarding in ways that go far beyond simple intoxication. Medieval people had no such professionals. The person who made your ale was probably the same person who made your bread, your candles, and your soap. There was no specialization, no expertise, no recognition that alcohol production and service could be skilled professions worthy of respect and compensation. The result was alcohol that was mediocre at best and dangerous at worst. No one was trying to create exceptional products because there was no market for excellence. No one was studying the science of fermentation because there was no framework for understanding it. No one was developing new techniques because there was no incentive for innovation. The technological infrastructure that supports modern drinking culture is also remarkable. We have refrigeration systems that keep beverages at the perfect temperature. We have carbonation systems that create the perfect level of fizz. We have filtration systems that ensure purity and consistency. We have packaging that preserves flavor and prevents contamination. We have transportation systems that can move beverages from anywhere in the world to your local bar. We have communication systems that allow you to learn about different products and find exactly what you're looking for. We have payment systems that make purchasing convenient and secure. Medieval people had barrels, carts, and coin. They had no way to control temperature, no understanding of carbonation, no ability to filter or purify their products. They had no reliable transportation, no way to communicate over long distances, no secure payment systems. This technological limitation meant that medieval alcohol was always a compromise. It was never as good as it could be, because they didn't have the tools to make it better. It was never as safe as it should be, because they didn't have the knowledge to make it safer. It was never as enjoyable as it might be because they didn't have the systems to make it more pleasurable. The social rituals around alcohol have also evolved in ways that prioritize connection and meaning over simple consumption. Today, we have wine and paint nights where people create art while socializing. We have beer and book clubs where people discuss literature while enjoying craft beverages. We have cocktail parties where the focus is on conversation and connection rather than getting drunk. We've learned to use alcohol as a tool for bringing people together around shared interests and activities. The drinking enhances the experience, but it's not the primary purpose. The goal is to create meaningful interactions, to build relationships, to celebrate achievements, to mark important occasions. Medieval social drinking was much more primitive. People gathered, they drank, they got drunk, they went home or passed out. There was no effort to create meaningful experiences, no recognition that alcohol could be part of something larger and more significant. The entertainment was whatever drunk people could come up with, usually singing, arguing, or fighting. There were no organized activities, no planned events, no effort to create positive experiences. The alcohol was both the entertainment and the end goal. This approach to social drinking created gatherings that were unpredictable, often dangerous, and rarely fulfilling. People attended because they had to, not because they wanted to. They participated because it was expected, not because they found it enjoyable, found it. The contrast with modern social drinking is stark. Today's alcohol-related social events are carefully planned, thoughtfully executed, and designed to create positive experiences for everyone involved. We have party planners who specialize in creating memorable events. We have caterers who understand food and beverage pairing. We have entertainers who know how to keep crowds engaged and happy. We've professionalized the business of social drinking in ways that prioritize safety, enjoyment, and meaningful connection. We've learned that the best parties are the ones where everyone has a good time and goes home with positive memories. The economic impact of this transformation is also worth considering. Today's alcohol industry supports millions of jobs in production, distribution, retail, and service. It generates billions in tax revenue that funds public services. It creates opportunities for entrepreneurship and innovation. It contributes to tourism and cultural exchange. The industry has also become increasingly responsible about its social impact. Many companies now support addiction treatment programs, fund research into alcohol-related health issues, and promote responsible consumption through their marketing and operations. Medieval alcohol production was small-scale, local, and economically insignificant. It created few jobs, generated little tax revenue, and had minimal impact on broader economic development. There was no recognition that the industry could or should take responsibility for its social impact. This lack of economic significance meant that there was no pressure to improve products, no incentive to innovate, no investment in better equipment or techniques. Medieval alcohol remained primitive and dangerous because there was no economic reason to make it better. The regulatory environment has also evolved dramatically. Today we have comprehensive laws governing alcohol production, distribution, and sale. We have agencies that monitor quality and safety. We have inspectors who ensure compliance with health and safety standards. We have penalties for violations that are severe enough to deter bad behavior. These regulations protect consumers from harmful products, ensure fair competition among producers, and provide recourse when things go wrong. They create a framework within which the industry can operate safely and responsibly. Medieval alcohol production was essentially unregulated. There were no quality standards, no safety inspections, no penalties for selling contaminated or dangerous products. The only regulation was whatever the local lord decided to impose, and that was usually focused on taxation rather than safety. This lack of regulation meant that consumers had no protection from harmful products, no recourse when things went wrong, and no assurance that what they were buying was safe to consume. The result was a market filled with dangerous, low-quality products that caused widespread harm. But perhaps most importantly, we've developed a culture today that recognizes alcohol as one option among many for socializing and entertainment. You can have an amazing night out without drinking a drop. You can go to concerts, movies, restaurants, clubs, festivals, and countless other venues where alcohol is available but not required. This recognition that alcohol is optional has transformed the entire social drinking experience. People who choose to drink do so because they want to, not because they have to. People who choose not to drink can still fully participate in social activities. The focus has shifted from alcohol consumption to social connection and shared experiences. Medieval people had no such options. Entertainment was limited, social activities were few, and alcohol was often the only thing that made difficult situations bearable. People didn't drink because they wanted to enhance their experience. They drank because there was nothing else to do. This created a culture where alcohol wasn't just a beverage, it was a necessity for social functioning. People who didn't drink were excluded from social activities, viewed with suspicion, and often isolated from their communities. The transformation from medieval drinking culture to modern drinking culture represents one of humanity's greatest achievements in learning how to balance pleasure with responsibility, freedom with safety, and individual choice with collective well-being. We've proven that it's possible to create systems that allow people to enjoy alcohol safely while protecting the vulnerable from harm. This progress didn't happen overnight. It took centuries of trial and error, countless tragedies, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge and wisdom. But we've proven that change is possible, that cultures can evolve, and that human suffering can be reduced through intelligent policy and social innovation. The medieval world couldn't imagine the sophisticated, safe, and enjoyable drinking culture we have today. They lived in a world where alcohol was both necessary and dangerous, where drinking was both required and potentially fatal, where the only choices were excess or abstinence. We've created a world where alcohol can be a source of pleasure rather than pain, where drinking can bring people together rather than tear them apart, where consumption can be a choice rather than a compulsion. And that transformation represents hope for continued progress in all areas of human experience. The next time you're enjoying a craft cocktail with friends, surrounded by safety measures and support systems that medieval people couldn't imagine, remember that you're participating in one of humanity's greatest success stories. You're benefiting from centuries of progress, innovation, and hard-won wisdom about how to live well. You're living in a world where the nightmares of medieval drinking culture have been replaced by the possibilities of modern drinking culture. And that's something worth celebrating, responsibly, of course. The story of how we transform drinking from a medieval nightmare into a modern pleasure is ultimately the story of human progress itself. It's about our capacity to learn from our mistakes, to build better systems, to create more humane ways of living. It's about the slow, difficult work of civilization, the gradual process of making life better for each successive generation. We still have work to do. Alcohol abuse remains a serious problem in our society, but we've made enormous progress and we continue to make progress every day. We've proven that change is possible, that suffering can be reduced, that people can learn to live better lives. The medieval world couldn't imagine our current reality. Perhaps our descendants will look back at our practices with the same mixture of horror and pity that we feel when we consider medieval drinking culture. Perhaps they'll have developed even better ways of balancing pleasure with responsibility, even more effective treatments for addiction, even safer and more enjoyable ways of socializing and celebrating. If so, they'll be building on the foundation we're laying today, just as we've built on the foundation laid by previous generations. The story of human progress is a story of incremental improvements, of small steps forward, of the gradual accumulation of knowledge and wisdom over time. So, raise your glass, if you choose to the long journey from medieval nightmare to modern possibility. Toast the countless people who suffered and died so that we might learn better ways of living. Celebrate the fact that you have choices they never had, options they couldn't imagine, and freedoms they died without ever experiencing. And remember that the work isn't finished. The transformation of drinking culture is proof that human beings can learn, can grow, can change. It's evidence that suffering is not inevitable, that progress is possible, that each generation can build a better world for the next. In a world that often feels dark and hopeless, that's a message worth remembering, worth celebrating, and worth sharing with others. The story of how we learned to drink better is ultimately the story of how we learned to live better. And that's a story that's still being written, one choice at a time, one generation at a time, one person at a time. The transformation continues even now, as we develop new technologies, new treatments, new understandings of how alcohol affects the human body and mind. We're still learning, still growing, still working to create a world where everyone can enjoy the pleasures of life while staying safe, healthy, and connected to others. The medieval world of drinking may be gone, but its lessons remain. They remind us of how far we've come, how much we've learned, and how much better things can be when we commit to progress, compassion, and human dignity. They remind us that the nightmares of the past don't have to be the reality of the future. And most importantly, they remind us that every time we choose to drink responsibly, every time we look out for our friends, every time we create positive experiences around alcohol, we're participating in this great human project of learning how to live well together. We're continuing the work of countless generations who dreamed of a better world and worked to make it real. That's the real story of drinking culture, not just the transformation from medieval nightmare to modern possibility, but the ongoing commitment to making things better, one drink at a time, one choice at a time, one person at a time. And that's a story worth being part of, whether you're raising a glass or simply raising awareness of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. The medieval people who did survive their drinking experiences often faced consequences that would shock us today. Imagine waking up after a night of heavy drinking to find that you'd agreed to sell your family's land, signed a contract you couldn't read, or promised your daughter in marriage to someone you'd never met sober. In medieval times, these weren't just embarrassing mistakes. They were legally binding agreements that could destroy entire families for generations. Today, we have legal protections against contracts signed under the influence. We understand that impaired judgment means impaired consent. We have lawyers who specialize in helping people escape agreements made while intoxicated. We have a legal system that recognizes alcohol as a mitigating factor in decision-making. Medieval people had no such protections. A drunk signature was as binding as a sober one. A promise made while intoxicated was as enforceable as one made with a clear head. The legal system didn't recognize impaired judgment as a valid defense, and the consequences of drunken decisions could follow you and your family for the rest of your lives. This created a culture where alcohol wasn't just dangerous to your health. It was dangerous to your entire social and economic position. People lost their homes, their land, their children, and their freedom through drunken agreements they barely remembered making. Families were torn apart by decisions made in alcoholic hazes, and entire communities could be reshaped by the poor judgment of a few intoxicated individuals. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the complete absence of any understanding that things could be different. Medieval people didn't question the system because they couldn't imagine alternatives. They accepted abuse, danger, and suffering as inevitable parts of life. They didn't fight for better conditions because they didn't believe better conditions were possible. This resignation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of medieval drinking culture. It wasn't just that people suffered. It was that they accepted their suffering as natural and unchangeable. They didn't seek help because they didn't believe help was possible. They didn't dream of better lives because they couldn't imagine what better might look like. The contrast with our modern world is profound and hopeful. Today we know that addiction is treatable, that recovery is possible, that people can change. We have proof that societies can evolve, that harmful practices can be abandoned, that progress is achievable. We have examples of people who have overcome severe alcohol problems and gone on to live fulfilling, productive lives. We have communities that support recovery, workplaces that accommodate treatment, families that understand addiction as a disease rather than a moral failing. We have medications that can help with withdrawal, therapies that can address underlying trauma, and support groups that provide ongoing encouragement and accountability. Most importantly, we have hope. We believe that things can get better, that people can change, that suffering is not inevitable. This hope drives innovation in treatment, motivates people to seek help, and sustains them through the difficult process of recovery. The medieval world had no such hope. They lived in a world where suffering was expected, where change was impossible, where the only escape from pain was temporary oblivion. They couldn't imagine a world where alcohol could be enjoyed responsibly, where drinking could be a choice rather than a compulsion, where people could find joy and connection without sacrificing their health and dignity. But we can imagine such a world because we live in it. We've created it, slowly and imperfectly, over centuries of struggle and progress. We've learned from the mistakes of the past, built on the insights of previous generations, and created systems that, while not perfect, are infinitely better than what came before. The transformation from medieval drinking culture to modern drinking culture is ultimately a story about human resilience and our capacity for growth. It's about the countless individuals who refused to accept that suffering was inevitable, who fought for better conditions, who dreamed of a world where pleasure didn't have to come at the cost of safety and dignity. It's about the gradual accumulation of knowledge, medical professionals who studied the effects of alcohol on the human body, social reformers who fought for laws protecting the vulnerable, entrepreneurs who created safer and more enjoyable drinking experiences, and ordinary people who chose to break cycles of abuse and create healthier patterns for their families. Today, when you walk into a modern bar, you're not just entering a place to drink, you're entering a space that represents centuries of human progress. The trained bartenders who monitor your consumption, the security cameras that deter violence, the ride-sharing apps that get you home safely, the emergency services that respond if things go wrong. All of these represent lessons learned from the medieval nightmare of uncontrolled drinking culture. The craft cocktails, with their precise measurements and carefully balanced flavors, represent our understanding of chemistry and taste. The variety of options available represents global trade and cultural exchange. The social norms that encourage moderation represent our evolving understanding of health and safety. The legal protections that prevent exploitation represent our commitment to protecting the vulnerable. Every aspect of modern drinking culture, from the sophisticated beverages to the safety systems that surround them, represents a choice to reject the medieval model of alcohol as a tool for escape, domination, and self-destruction. We've chosen instead to create a culture where alcohol can be a tool for connection, celebration, and pleasure, when used responsibly and with proper safeguards in place. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It required conscious effort, deliberate choices, and the courage to imagine that things could be better. It required people to stand up against systems that harmed the vulnerable, to invest in research and education, to create laws and institutions that prioritized human welfare over profit or tradition, and the work continues today. Every time we choose to drink responsibly, every time we look out for our friends, every time we support someone in recovery, every time we advocate for better policies around alcohol, we're participating in this ongoing project of making the world a little bit better than we found it. The medieval people who suffered through their brutal drinking culture couldn't imagine the world we live in today. They couldn't conceive of a society where alcohol could be enjoyed safely, where people could choose not to drink without social consequences, where help was available for those who needed it, where the vulnerable were protected rather than exploited. But we can imagine an even better world than the one we have now. We can envision a future where alcohol-related harm is even rarer, where treatment for addiction is even more effective, where the social and cultural benefits of drinking are even greater, while the risks are even smaller. That future won't build itself. It will require the same kind of conscious effort, deliberate choices, and courage to imagine better that brought us from the medieval nightmare to our current reality. It will require each of us to take responsibility for our own choices, while also working to create systems that support good choices and protect those who struggle. The story of drinking culture is ultimately the story of human civilization itself. The slow, difficult, never-ending work of learning how to live together in ways that maximize human flourishing while minimizing human suffering. It's about recognizing that the way things are is not the way things have to be, and that each generation has the power to build a better world for the next. So the next time you're enjoying a perfectly crafted cocktail in a safe, welcoming environment, surrounded by friends who care about your well-being, remember that you're not just having a drink. You're participating in one of humanity's greatest success stories. You're living proof that progress is possible, that suffering can be reduced, that people can learn to live better lives, and that's something worth celebrating. Responsibly, of course. The transformation from medieval drinking nightmare to modern drinking culture represents hope for continued progress in all areas of human experience. It reminds us that no matter how dark things might seem, no matter how entrenched harmful systems might appear, change is always possible when people commit to making it happen. The medieval world is gone, but its lessons remain. They remind us how far we've come, how much we've learned, and how much better things can be when we refuse to accept suffering as inevitable. They remind us that the nightmares of the past don't have to be the reality of the future. And most importantly, they remind us that every choice we make, every stand we take, every effort we make to build a better world contributes to the great human project of learning how to live well together. That's the real legacy of the transformation from medieval drinking culture to modern drinking culture. Not just that we learn to drink better, but that we learn to live better. And that's a story that's still being written, one choice at a time, one generation at a time, one person at a time. The future is unwritten, and it's up to us to ensure that it's better than the past. The medieval people who suffered through their drinking culture couldn't imagine our world. Let's work to create a world that we can barely imagine, one where human flourishing is not just possible, but inevitable.